Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be getting started in about another 2 minutes. Thank you. All right, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. I would like to welcome everyone to the Counter Narrative Project webinar on harm reduction. This particular webinar is about our Black gay men and Crystal Meth conversation guide. Welcome to today's webinar. As for webinar guidance, it's important to know that all participants will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the webinar. Ask a question, you should go ahead and use the Q&A button on your screen. If you are using a phone to join today's webinar, you should go ahead and tap your screen and the Q&A button should pop up. If you are using your computer, there's a Q&A button along the bottom or along the top of your screen. So if you have a question, we will be monitoring the Q&A box to respond to questions. You can ask questions throughout the webinar, even though you will be in listen-only mode. So today we will have two presenters. You get the pleasure of having me. My name is Johnny Cornegay. I am the Mobilization Director for the Counter Narrative Project, and I will be moderating this conversation. We will also have a presentation by L. Michael Gipson of Faith Walk LLC and Black Bear Brotherhood, and also the author of our conversation guide. So as I mentioned, as you have questions throughout, please feel free to enter your questions into the Q&A box. The mission of the Counter Narrative Project is to build power among Black gay men and work in coalition and solidarity with all movements committed to racial and social justice. You can find us online on our website at thecounternarrative.org. While you're there, please be sure to join our mailing list. You can also follow us on social media. On Facebook, we are at The Counter Narrative Project. On Instagram, we are at The Counter Narrative. And on Twitter, we are at Building Desire. To ground us in today's conversation, I wanted to open with a quote. Black men loving Black men is a call to action, an acknowledgement of responsibility. We take care of our own kind when the night grows cold and silent. These days, the nights are cold-blooded and the silence echoes with complicity. That is a quote from Joseph Beam. One of the things that we found really important as we embarked on this conversation guide project was that we wanted to shift the narrative and also surround our brothers with love as we have this conversation about crystal meth. So I want to ground us in this quote from Joseph Beam as we embark on this conversation today. Thank you. To that end, I want to open today's presentation with a list of resources. I'm going to do this at the beginning here, and we'll do it again at the very end of the presentation before the Q&A. So if there are individuals who are watching this webinar and are interested in resources, we have a few of them listed here. So there's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration National Helpline, which is 1-800-662-HELP. We have the Harm Reduction Coalition that can be reached at harmreduction.org. And we also have Narcotics Anonymous World Services that can be reached at na.org. For any individuals that are in need of resources, in addition to this guide, you have some lists here. Thank you. So let's jump into the meat of our conversation. And I'm beginning here to ground us in how our feelings about substance use have been shaped. I wanted to start here because I think it's very important to understand that anti-drug policy and anti-drug messaging has been racialized in this country. The first law that was passed was a local law in San Francisco in 1875 that specifically outlawed the smoking of opium. At that time, the smoking of opium was largely tied to Chinese men and boys in smoking dens in San Francisco. So this local law, specifically, interestingly enough, had a carve out that did not, it had an exception for individuals that opium and injection of tinctures of opiates. So there was a specific carve out. And at that time, those two methods were popular among whites in the San Francisco area. So I wanted to start here. As it relates to Black folks in this country, I want to bring us to February 8th, 1914. There was an article that was published in the New York Times entitled Negro Cocaine. Specifically listed that murder and insanity among lower class Blacks because they have taken to sniffing since being deprived of whiskey by prohibition. So as you take a look at these various articles, you can see that much of how we have been viewing substance use in this country and much of how it's been talked about has been racialized. And that takes us right to 1987. The New York Times, once again, it's an article that's entitled New Violence Seen in Users of Cocaine. This article was published on March 7th of 1987. And it doesn't specifically mention race. Interestingly enough, though, it does mention the geography. So we're talking about East Harlem. What it specifically talks about in this article is in New York and other cities where crack use has become widespread, the violent, erratic, paranoid behavior among heavy cocaine users, and this growing appearance of a condition known as cocaine psychosis. I want to take a pause here. When we start thinking of words in these publications such as violent, erratic, paranoid, this all shapes how we see substance use in our history. And we wanted to ground us to understand how much of the anti-drug laws and how many people have viewed substance use over the years has kind of been seen through this lens. So when we bring that into the current opioid crisis versus the crack epidemic, we have this very interesting dichotomy. So when we talk about the crack epidemic, we're talking about those affected being Black and brown, urban, and unemployed. As it relates to the opioid crisis, those affected being white, suburban, and blue collar. When we look at villains for the crack epidemic, we are talking about neighborhood drug dealers, so very localized, whereas the villains for the opioid crisis, we're talking about pharmaceutical companies. Let's look at the resolutions, right? So we know this from history. So when we look at the crack epidemic, the resolutions were imprisonment. We expanded the war on drugs, and we had things like the 3 strikes law that appeared. Conversely, when we talk about resolutions in this new opioid crisis, we are talking more about prevention and treatment and legislation, et cetera. So wanted to ground us in this discussion as we begin to talk about how we've seen these things. So let's bring it home. There are few studies on Black gay men who use crystal meth, and this particular study was done in 1999, entitled Methamphetamine Use Patterns Among Urban Black Men Who Have Sex with Men. And a couple of quick notes. It notes that primarily methamphetamines were used in private venues such as at homes or in homes of friends, and reported obtaining methamphetamines from multiple sources. And men who reported exchanging sex for methamphetamine reported greater use in public venues such as sex clubs, sex parties, and circuit parties. And also reports that men who were using methamphetamines also used multiple substances, but on average of 9 days within 30 days. So this particular study was done in 2009. Even looking at the language used in this particular study, we still see some of the challenges, right, with language and how these things are being perceived. But we wanted to talk specifically about what exists out there from a study currently. And the link to that study is also included at the bottom of your screen. So that brings us right to our conversation guide, the Can We Talk conversation guide. The purpose of the guide for information and support for concerned individuals interested in learning more about crystal meth and about how to engage with loved ones and community members who may be users of crystal meth using harm reduction methodologies. The document provides basic information, offers strategies on how to reduce negative health effects related to crystal meth use, and also links users to harm reduction and, if desired, recovery services. So I do want to make a note that as I turn this over to Michael, I'm going to introduce Michael next. This guide was not developed as like a comprehensive end-all be-all solution, right? It's a conversation guide. It's a way to start this discussion, and it's a way to ground that discussion in love. So I wanted to make that note before I go ahead and introduce our author of the guide, L. Michael Gipson. So L. Michael Gipson is a writer, educator, and 24-year advocate for a host of social justice causes. L. Michael Gipson is the co-founder of Beyond Identities Community Center for LGBTQ Youth in Cleveland, the Black Alphabet Film Festival in Chicago, and the Black Bear Brotherhood in Detroit. Currently, Michael Gipson is the founder and principal of Faith Walk LLC and the Urban Rights Project. A Red Dirt Press author, Gipson serves as editor-at-large at soultracks.com and lead writer and co-producer of the PBS docuseries Indie Soul Journeys. I want to go ahead and welcome L. Michael Gipson to the webinar. And I'm going to go ahead and click for Michael. So you're going to hear him saying next slide so I can move him forward. But Michael, you can bring yourself off of mute and let me see if we can hear you. Give me 1 second. Let me see.
All right. Now it's letting me. Hi.
Hello. I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Just one thing real quick, Johnny. You might want to check the recording when you're done because you were going in and out a few times, and at least once you froze.
Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Hi, everybody. We're here to talk about Can We Talk, a Black gay man's conversation on crystal meth. And the purpose of this guide, as Johnny pointed out, is to give you a tool to approach loved ones, friends, family members, partners, colleagues who may be engaged in crystal meth use. And how would you even begin to have that conversation? Gives you some background on trying to understand why people would use, given some of the scare tactic information we've already received about crystal meth. And not that those scare tactics weren't based in facts. There's lots of downsides to crystal meth use, but to try to understand the psychology of someone who may decide to use, and also to begin a conversation that's not rooted in an abstinence-only approach to crystal meth, but a harm reduction approach to meet the person who may be using where they are, and hopefully guide them to a pathway that is either harm reduction or abstinence, but respecting their agency and their choice. Slide. So let's talk about what is crystal meth. So crystal meth is a synthetic psychostimulant with significant mood-enhancing qualities. It is an illegal recreational drug, and it is often developed in labs combining ingredients derived from over-the-counter drugs, such as pseudoephedrine. As you can imagine, that when crystal meth really first hit the market, suddenly you could not buy common cold medication because people were using it, those cold medications, to cook up meth in labs. You had to go to the pharmacy and prove that you needed it. So they cook it up with meths with toxic substances. The drug works by boosting the release and stops the uptake of a neurotransmitter or brain chemical called dopamine. In doing so, meth increases the levels of dopamine production in the brain and releases it into the body. And dopamine, as you may not know, lives in the reward centers of our brain. It delivers that a sense of euphoria and is the part of us that makes us feel good, right? So dopamine plays a critical role in motor function, motivation, reward. It's how the brain experiences and interprets pleasure. That also gives you some indication of why people may be using it. Crystal meth can produce these euphoric feelings for up to 12 hours, which is significantly different from something like crack, which may only produce the euphoric feelings for minutes, and can cause some users to repeatedly crave its stimulating effects. Frequent use can lead to considerable and permanent changes in the brain function, including the structure and function of brain areas linked to emotion and memory. These changes may remain long after a user has stopped taking meth. It may be reversed, but only after a long period of abstinence for some users. This is partially why chronic users develop emotional and cognitive challenges that can either be short-term or long-lasting. Usually a user's systems will be free of the drug after 2 or 3 days of abstinence, though crashes, and we'll talk about what crashes are, can last considerably longer, with symptoms that can persist for days, weeks, even up to a year for some users. And the length of enduring symptoms may vary based on the person and how long they were using. When taken regularly or in high doses, crystal meth may cause something called methamphetamine psychosis. And so we'll talk a little bit more about some of the dangerous effects. We won't have time in the course of this webinar to go into all of the dangers of crystal meth. That's what the guide is for. So this is kind of like your teaser trailer. Slide. Crystal meth by another name. So we know that in the streets, we're used to hearing things like Tina, Crystal, Chrissy, Crank. One of the things that I found interesting when developing the guide was, and also I think for those of you who may have seen Michael Rice's film Party Boy, was an understanding of how crystal meth iconography and symbolism is actually all around us. Obviously we've heard Tina used a lot, but there's also, like on dating apps, for instance, people will capitalize the T in party to signify that they're interested in people who are using crystal meth, or they may have a party hat, or they may have other types of emoji symbols that signify that they're looking to party. Also, use of the term party and play, or PNP, you may see show up in people's app profiles. So crystal meth, as he points out, is all around us. Slide. So how do you begin to even talk to somebody who's experiencing these issues from a harm reduction approach? So we're going to give you a few motivational interviewing techniques. Again, this guide isn't supposed to be the be all and end all, but it is supposed to give you some pointers. So I do recommend that you take a minute and engage learning a little bit more about motivational interviewing. We'll touch on some of that in this presentation. But if you know that you're going to engage someone in this type of conversation or intervention, then it may be useful to have an understanding of motivational interviewing. But, have your talking points about the health impacts of meth, how it can impact both that person and how, as someone who cares about the person, it impacts you, and how you can adopt or avoid risks of more severe and permanent and fatal health outcomes, coming at the person not from a place of judgment, but of a place of support, acknowledging that incremental behavior change is driven by that person's willingness and ability to adopt such changes. You can't want this more for the person, and the person wants it for themselves. And they may not work on the first conversation, but emphasize that you believe in that person's ability to reduce harm to themselves, and maybe talk through some of the personal assets that demonstrate the resiliencies of that person's ability to engage in more positive behaviors, less harmful behaviors to their bodies. Slides. Have talk leverage points. What matters to that person? What is something that you may be able to raise when you talk about the benefits of harm reduction? It may be for some people that they have a child that you might, they want to be around for and present for, and you're worried about their capacity to do that. For other people, it may be that you talk about harm reduction as a way to sustain their high. And harm reduction as a way to maybe intensify or prolong their high if they care about that more. So that's something, every person's leverage point is going to be different, and the person best that you're talking to and making that decision. Consider drawbacks, such as the prolonged sexual prowess. So one of the things that came out of last year's counter-narrative project research with the Harm Reduction Coalition and a couple of other partners was that prolonged sexual prowess and sex was a major driver for why men of color who were LGBT or who were gay and bisexual were using crystal meth. That was one of the top reasons that they identified in surveys. So if that's part of it, then talk about the fact that you may end up being impotent as a prolonged use of crystal meth, and that this drug, while it may allow you to have sex longer in the short term, long term the effects may be deleterious. And open the floor to discuss how they feel. What are they thinking? While this guide offers you some research-based information about why people are using, the person in front of you can best tell you why they think they're using. And so you can have that conversation based on their beliefs, their behaviors, what they think of as risks and negative consequences for themselves, things that are personal to them, not to you. You may have a different value system than the person, or may have different beliefs than the person. So remember, keeping this centered on that individual. Slide. So this is, as we pointed out, a few motivational interviewing basics. This is actually taken directly from the guide. So talks about establishing and building rapport, making sure that the space that you're engaging in this conversation is safe, comfortable, that you're using empathetic language, and that even when the person is maybe raising the stakes of the conversation and making it a difficult one, that you remain calm, that you remain coming from a place of help and sympathy and empathy. Focus on that, again, that person and their recovery or their engagement in harm reduction. And explore what they think of as the barriers to change. What is it that they're afraid of? What is it that they think that will happen if they stop using crystal meth? Because crystal meth offers some really powerful benefits to the person. I mean, and we don't like to think about drugs as offering benefit, but you think about how often confidence was lacking in individuals before they used crystal meth, and suddenly they felt like the most confident person in the world. You're asking them to give that up, and replace it with what? So you have to talk through their ambivalences and their barriers, and be prepared to point out discrepancies in their lines of logic, as they may identify some things that you can poke holes through, and to keep the conversation open-ended and affirm them throughout. Again, this is not about you creating a hierarchy where you feel like you're better than the person because they're engaged in drug use, and make sure that that is always central in this conversation. Slide. There are some ways that we talk about crystal meth. Johnny pointed out earlier that we've kind of borrowed from the media, maybe even borrowed from science or borrowed from law enforcement, that is not helpful when you're trying to have a conversation. So we do offer a list of do say and don't say certain things. I mean, certainly, you already know that conversation that is judgmental or demeaning or creates hierarchy, um, or power where you have power and the person doesn't is gonna spark a resistant reaction, and it's not gonna be useful or helpful. So maybe you practice the conversation and catch yourself using words like addict or fiend or junkie. Those are not words that are going to be helpful in this conversation. This is the person who uses substances. They are not the substance. They are not the demeaning or dehumanizing language that we often use to discuss people who are engaged in frequent or chronic drug use. And as someone who has been, um, you know, as a community that is quick to kind of use judgmental language, um, in reads and shade and all of that, it may be all the more important that you practice this kind of positive language, um, that's going to put the person more at ease than not at ease. Slide. So again, more opportunity for language that can help. You know, it's not about being clean. These people are not dirty. Um, for those who've kind of had the conversation around HIV, we know that this kind of language around clean is problematic, and we don't want to engage in that even when we're having the conversation around substance users. Um, and, using, fear of overdose or overdosing. you know, People who have been using crystal meth for a while feel fairly confident in their ability to not overdose, right? And so using the language of accidental drug poisoning helps to reframe and recenter that conversation about the fact that uh, things happen, and it may not have anything to do with your capacity or your ability or your experience in having used this drug for however long you've used it successfully, and put successfully in quotes, that the person you're buying it from may have a different product that you're not aware of this one time, and in that one time you can have an accidental drug poisoning. Um, and talk about the potential for self-harm. Talk about the fact that the person's been moody, if that is true for that person, that you've noticed them appearing to be hyper or agitated or paranoid, sleep deprived, depressed, in terms, instead of language like, oh, I see you've been crazy, or you've been you've been lunching. So anything that's gonna, again, make that person feel like you're creating a conversation where you know better than them. Slide. So let's talk about why people use drugs, like why people use meth. It feels good. If it didn't feel good, America would not be the number one audience in the world for drugs. There's a rush. And, I think that oftentimes when we have this conversation about substance use, we talk about it as personal failures or weaknesses or not being able to deal. When a lot of times how people got involved in substance use was that it felt good. Someone gave them something, they tried it, it made them feel amazing, and they wanted to keep feeling amazing. And there are lots of ways in which people use all kinds of things to feel amazing, from food to cigarettes to alcohol. This acceptable, but can also be harmful if used in high quantities. And with cigarettes, you don't even have to have high quantities in order to get to both the euphoric feeling and for it to do damage. So think about, that. Again, sex, for people who are topping, there's decreased sensitivity, so they're able to go longer. For guys who are bottoming, there is decreased sensitivity, so they're able to go longer. This also plays a role in how crystal meth gets used in sex parties, where people are able to engage in sexual multiple partners, because their bodies are desensitized. They're not feeling the full feeling that they would otherwise be feeling including pain, which would allow them to engage in multiple or concurrent sexual partnerships for 24 hours, 48 hours. You hear people start a meth sex party over on a Friday and it doesn't end until Sunday night. Time for people to go back to work. So there's a real benefit around that for people who are looking for more sexual adventure. Endurance, uh, again, this is methamphetamines. It is a stimulant. It does provide increased energy, which allows you to dance longer, work longer, party longer, have sex longer. People end up not eating. Some people do use this as a weight management drug, particularly people who are part of gym culture. We'll talk a little bit about that. And it provides energy boosters. And so, again, people may start out using this drug for reasons of productivity or, not able to focus and they want to focus at work. I mean, one of the things that's interesting, I had a conversation this week, is that Adderall is kind of a sister drug to crystal meth, and we don't like to think about it, but it is a stimulant that allows people to focus with high energy. They don't go to sleep for days. Similar symptoms that you would have from crystal meth. Slide. Belonging. So one of the things that was interesting to me when I first became aware of crystal meth as part of gay culture, it was like 2004, and there was a movie called Meth the Movie. And in that movie, the gay men at the time were white gay men, which I also think kind of helped create this mythology that this was only a white gay issue and not something that brothers were engaging in, was that it made them have access suddenly to kind of a secret society, that there was language that they were only people who were part of crystal meth culture knew, that you would spot each other in the club because y'all weren't drinking, and that other people who were users were drinking, not users were drinking, and so they were able to spot each other and have conversations. And I was kind of also, again, part of the secret society, that you suddenly had access to bodies and certain body types that you may not have had access to. So, guys who were really muscly or really slim and part of crystal meth culture would allow you to engage them in sex, and maybe not have allowed you to engage them in sex under other circumstances. And so that was also a draw. And people long for community. And people can say what you will about drug using communities. They are a sense, for the people who are in them, a community. They know each other. They sometimes look out for each other even. And so there's an insider language and codes of conduct, like the whole PNP. I still have to correct people around what PNP means to this day, because they assume it just means any drug, or any kind of like sex party, and they don't necessarily associate it with crystal meth. Ease of social anxiety. You think about how many people we now know who have depression and anxiety issues, and suddenly they're able to self-medicate with something that allows them to have greater confidence and self-esteem, makes them feel more powerful. As you think about who this drug may be more attractive to, people who are vulnerable, people who feel powerless in their lives, people who are often marginalized and disenfranchised. Well, that becomes a really easy recipe for Black gay men to engage in this drug. And you think about how lots of people interpret or receive the gay community as kind of a cliquish space. To be able to ease their anxiety, to be able to enter that space, this drug becomes a way for them to do that. And again, you can get more done on meth. People say that their creativity is higher, that they are more innovative on meth. Again, this could be part of language folks use to justify their use that may not be rooted in reality. The reality is they might be as creative and as innovative without it, but because they maybe found their gateway into that creativity or into that innovation through meth, this becomes the way that they think that that's the only way they're able to be that. So that's something else to consider. Next slide. So again, we talked about the fact that there's a weight management element to crystal meth because people won't eat for days, or um, and so there is a subset within gym culture who uses crystal meth as part of, again, being part of the secret society. It does boost their productivity. Um, these are also the bodies that are idolized in club and circuit party culture. And so if you may have some body image issues, and this drug allows you to address those issues directly by either helping you to lose weight, helping you to stay and work out in the gym longer, helping you to gain entree into club party circuit culture. Those are all things to consider when thinking about why people may use meth. And then self-medication. We, especially Black folks and Black gay folks, are not necessarily quick to go to a therapist when we're experiencing issues like depression. We have histories of not trusting medical institutions with good reason. We don't always have access to medical or mental health providers or behavior specialists who look like us, who understand our experience, who may not even be able to find anyone in our local area who can service us, because there is such a lack of qualified mental health professionals and behavioral specialists who are culturally competent around the issues of race and sexual orientation, or gender identity. And so crystal meth offers a way to self-medicate from the depression, from the anxiety. Of course, um, again, if with any drug, they also exacerbate all of those issues when you crash. So whatever, if you have anxiety, you may end up with paranoia. If you have depression, you crash and you may be suicidal. So it's the self-medication may work again in the short term, but long term it has deleterious effects. Slide. Exactly. There we go. So other topics that are in the guide, we could talk through every single section, but I just want to make sure that you are aware of what other things are in the guide. Um, so it's an introduction of the cost benefit analysis for harm reduction or abstinence from meth. I think one of the things we probably haven't really done so far is kind of describe what harm reduction is. So, in harm reduction is all about meeting people where they are. In general, you give the person or people who are using crystal meth the information, means, and opportunities for behavior change so that they can choose to improve their health and well-being. And part of meeting that goal is met by asking and understanding why the person is using crystal meth and how they believe it benefits their life, and to just then be open and listen and not cut off and not counter, but to just listen at first and receive. Uh, and then recognizing that when you think about the dangers of the drug, to maybe share some of the things that the person may not know, that meth can cause paranoia, psychosis. I think we're all pretty much familiar with the tooth loss at this point from pictures and images, but it also can cause brain damage that is permanent. Impotence, which we talked about, again, that hard dick and easy, smooth ability to, bottom for lots of partners can be something that leads to impotence later. High blood pressure, kidney damage, liver damage, undesirable weight loss. So you might have started as a weight management drug, but maybe with prolonged use and not eating 2 and 3 days at a time, you're now starving the body. You're now engaging the body in an undesirable level of weight loss. We see wasting from people who have been hard long-term crystal meth users. We've seen those in pictures. And those are just some of the dangers that are associated with. And so it's about not about scaring the person, but about making sure you're sharing with them accurate medical information about what it is that they could experience that they may not be aware of. And how crystal meth enters the body. This is also a way to talk about harm reduction, since crystal meth can be used or taken into the body by smoking it, injecting it, um, entering the rectum with it. There's just lots of ways in which people engage in use. And to be clear, those ways can have higher levels of danger depending on how it's being imbibed into the body. And so talking about harm reduction is to talk about how crystal meth enters the body and presents a constellation of possible health and safety issues and concerns. And while also recognizing that all of it, any way you take crystal meth, whether you're smoking it or injecting it, even while there are levels, all of it can be dangerous to the body. And also, so when thinking about the other behavioral risk concerns that people in using crystal meth may engage in is condomless anal sex. So after a while, if you're at a sex party that's lasting for days, maybe there aren't enough condoms and you don't want to leave because this is where the drugs and the fun is. So you may engage in more condomless sex. You're also, because your inhibitions are lowered and you're high, you also may not be as careful or as safe as you would have been otherwise. Marathon sex. Again, sex with multiple partners over multiple weekends in a row with multiple partners actually can do damage to the body. The body needs time to recover from sexual engagement, depending on the type of sex you're engaged in. There's also meth crashes, which is what happens when that high is over and your body goes to withdrawal. And, people who are users of crystal meth describe these crashes as the worst feelings in the world. Taking meth on an empty stomach also creates more harm. Taking your HIV drugs with meth also can have some unintended consequences, unintended effects. It may be one of the reasons why you want to encourage that person, if they are a person living with HIV, that they talk very openly and candidly with their doctor about the fact that they are using crystal meth. Maybe the HIV drug that they're on isn't going to work well with that and may need to be changed. And there are other types of consequences that one has to consider when living with HIV and using crystal meth. We're talking about a drug that ultimately breaks down the body and a disease that ultimately breaks down the immune system if not managed or treated well. So obviously there's some dangers that are heightened for persons living with HIV than there are for persons without HIV. And talking about each of the harm reduction methods are offered in the guide for all of the primary risks. We have a pretty long laundry list of ways that people can reduce their harm for each category. Slide. So again, this is just a laundry list of the different ways that short-term impact of meth use. Because some folks may be like, well, I'm just going to use it for a little while, thinking that even a little while won't do much damage, or whatever the damage is reversible. So these are just short-term impacts of meth use. You can see everything from the psychological to heart, to obviously again the grinding of the teeth. The rotten teeth is always a very popular image for the crystal meth user. But also think about, for that gym culture person, the musculature. It can cause convulsions or loss of coordination, both of which are pretty critical when you're thinking about wanting to maintain a certain type of physique. And obviously with anything you're asking the body to filter through the kidneys and the liver, there's potential damage. So if you're on PrEP, for instance, which already taxes the liver and the kidneys, and you're on crystal meth, again, you're asking your body to do double duty for something that is not designed to do. So next slide. So long-term impact. These are kind of the longer term damage. Again, all of it elevated from what you saw before, including the possibility of a stroke, clotting. The neuropsychological impairments, again, are not necessarily impairments that one can recover from even after they stop using crystal meth. These may be permanent. The other thing is that people have had psychosis experiences up to a year or more after having stopped using crystal meth. So even though they may have gotten to a point of abstinence, and they're on that pathway, you can still experience the side effects for years in the same way that you would say PCP or LSD. Slide. So in using crystal meth, is the term is overamping, as instead of overdosing, for meth use or accidental drug poisoning, which we talked about earlier in our language. And it can be acute or chronic. Again, acute is when a person uses a large amount of meth at one time and experience an adverse reaction. We're used to that, thinking about that when we're thinking about overdosing, or in this instance, overamping, which also can be fatal here. But the other part of it we don't always think about is how chronic high drug use over time has a cumulative negative health effect, that can lead to severe sleep disturbances where people may not sleep for a week. And as you know, if the body doesn't rest, the body begins to mentally, not just physically, but mentally break down, which can cause extreme mood changes, violent outbursts. You know, it might have to be one of those people that you see on the news where the police is trying to figure out what is going on with them and they're wilding out. So again, there's also an effect that the cumulative use of high drug use of crystal meth can cause. And so the guide includes information on how to manage an episode of overamping in order to help reduce the anxiety, the delusions that a person may be experiencing, and the paranoia. So if you are with someone who's having this moment, you know what to do. We provide you some tools around that. Slide. So, we've talked a lot about harm reduction, and this manual or this guide, conversation guide, speaks directly to our belief that harm reduction is the way approach to addressing a crystal meth user. Uh, but obviously there is abstinence as a pathway as well. And so we talk about both aspects, and thinking about maybe harm reduction as a recovery spectrum. So from harm reduction to abstaining from meth, recognizing that some people may never get to abstinence, that they may just stay with reducing the harm while using, and that again, that's the agency that person has over their body. Um, so it should be noted that unlike some drugs, like an alcoholic can take a drug that can make them sick if they use alcohol, and there are other like treatment replacement therapies for heroin or opioid users. There is no government approved drug that can help a person recover from meth addiction. And meth has been um, in the research demonstrated similar kind of recovery outcomes that you would see from somebody on crack, which means that it is incredibly difficult to get off. You should expect that person to relapse several times uh, before they ultimately either engage in harm reduction or abstain altogether. The treatment does include detox, and it's followed by behavioral and psychological treatment. The meth user should seek a medical and psychiatric evaluation to see what level of damage has been done to the body, which can be recovered through treatment, and design a treatment plan that's feasible for that person. Like, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach when helping someone get off of crystal meth. And again, we've talked about an incredible array, a whole menu of benefits for people who are using them that has to be considered and replaced. And so helping that person understand why they were using and what they were getting out of it and how they can address those needs, because those needs don't go away just because the crystal meth stopped being used. So treatment may also involve exercise, nutritional guidance, other supports to live drug-free. And these are just some of the different types of therapies that are available for people who are trying to get off of crystal meth. And so if one approach doesn't work, there are other therapeutic approaches that someone can try before they're ultimately able to abstain permanently from crystal meth. All right, slide. Uh, So again, with treatment, you might be addressing, you might have to treat some of the symptoms of the non-use, so antidepressants to help that person deal with insomnia and other medical issues that come from mental health issues that come from it. Because psychosis is such a prominent feature of crystal meth, you may have to go on antipsychotics to help address those features of withdrawal. Uh, There are other drugs here that help deal with to calm anxiety and agitation. So as you can see, even though the crystal meth can exacerbate so many other aspects of the person's physical and mental health, that those things may then have to be treated for a while, if not for life, after the person gets off. Um, and there are some other drugs here that help crystal meth reduce crystal meth cravings. Um, So those are things that are listed here, other types of medications. All right, slide.
Perfect. Michael, thank you so much for this amazing work. I do have a question
Sure.
for you, but I want to return to this conversation about resources really quick,
Sure.
because I want to make sure that people understand where they can go if they're interested in more information. So, of course, there's this guide, and thank you all so much for watching this webinar. But in terms of additional resources that may be helpful, there's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration helpline at 800-662-HELP. It's 365, 24 hours, 7 days a week. So that is available, as well as the Harm Reduction Coalition and Narcotics Anonymous World Services. So that information is there for everyone. And Michael, my question for you is, you thank you so much for doing this work, because I spent just a cursory a real high level look at what information was available as I was doing my research, and so little of what's out there seemed to speak to the Black gay community. So I wanted to talk to you about that. How difficult was it to kind of pull what did you find in terms of specific information about us? Is there a lot out there, and what should we be doing about it?
Yeah, so I am not a chemical dependency counseling expert. I am not, my background has been in behavioral health and addressing issues of public health and safety. And so I was coming to this as a novice, as a researcher, just trying to see what was available. Little to nothing spoke to the Black or Latino experience at all. Um, and not only that, in terms of region, most of the information was very coastal. So crystal meth as an issue hit New York and San Francisco and LA as gay communities first and earliest. And so the language used and even the imagery and iconography of the community's response was perhaps a lot more permissive, sometimes coarser, often graphic, um, in ways that would not be as tolerable or as well received by a Black gay community from the Midwest or the South, which, you know, I'm mostly familiar with and come out of. And so, yeah, like I could see someone who might have wanted to address this issue going to some of the resources that are out there. And most of the resources also are pretty dated, right? Like a lot of this stuff came out in the 90s and the early aughts. And, you know, once they were out there, they were just out there. And so it wasn't a lot of updating. It's not, you know, in some ways that's understandable because this issue isn't something that evolves over time, right? It's not like the HIV virus where you're, you know, constantly finding out new information about it. And so I could see if I was a Black person trying to access the stuff, I would be like, oh, this is a bunch of white stuff. You know, this is a white issue. This is not our issue. This is even looking at the language and how people are talking about it. Language is very rooted in white gay culture. And so, you know, and I did share some of that information because Black gay community folks are not only existing in Black gay communities, right? So some of them party and exist in white gay spaces. So I want to make sure that it was speaking to the spectrum of our community. So no matter where you are, you could receive this information and use this information as you deem fit.
You know, if you could, what is your hope for how community-based organizations and how agencies will use this guide?
Well, I hope they will, one, use this guide to educate their staffs on how to talk about this issue. One, to recognize that it is an issue. So I think that one of the things that we in Detroit at Black Bear Brotherhood found, we held a community forum about this issue in February, and we screened Party Boy, which shows Black gay men, Black gay and bisexual men engaging in crystal meth use and talking about their use, and you actually see them use. And you know, and a lot of brothers were like, I didn't know this was an issue. But then when you start pointing out, you know, the emojis on the apps and the capital T, like, oh yeah, I've seen that. I just thought that meant cocaine, or I thought that meant marijuana. And you're like, no, hun, that's me. So it's crystal meth. And so I think this is a hidden epidemic in our community, partially because we're slow to want to receive one more thing. We already have so many other things that we as Black gay folk already are dealing with, already are stereotyped with. And so, you know, we're not necessarily interested in taking on yet another identity, crystal meth user that's stigmatized and considered negative. But this is in our community, it's happening, it's real. And when you think about, again, I think what I was most struck by in 2004 when I saw Meth the movie, and it was all white gay men in that movie, was when they talked about feeling powerful, when they talked about the confidence it gave them, when they talked about community belonging. And back then, crystal meth was cheap, which is different now. Like, so they talked about how they could, you know, $20 could get them high all weekend. Now, crystal meth, because it's moved into other communities, that high now might cost you $60 to $100, $120 for a weekend. But so it was a cheap high for a really long time that lasted longer than marijuana even, or lasted longer than crack cocaine, certainly. And so I was like, of course this is going to hit our community.
Right.
You know, and all of the markers were there. It was just a matter of time. And so, yeah, I mean, and because it's harder to get off of than a lot of other drugs, you know, my first and foremost recommendation is to not try this drug at all. You know, so if you've never tried it, don't try it.
Right. And what I like about what you also included in the guide is, you know, even though we know that that would be the ideal situation, the reality is that people will, and it's still, you know, making sure that we love on our folks. So Michael, I just want to thank you for this amazing work, and, you know, having this guide exist for our community, and really am excited, or the word I would like to use is hopeful, about our ability to now begin to have this conversation that is long overdue, and also learn more about the ways substances are being used within our community and being able to love on our folks. So thank you. You can download the guide. We've had a link at the top there for a while. So if you're watching this, you can see it, but it's bit.ly/Can We Talk CNP guide. And you can download a copy of the guide as well as review other webinars that we've done on the topic. I want to thank everyone who has been able to join us for this particular webinar. And L. Michael Gipson, I want to thank you once again for this amazing work. Thank you for your work, brother.
Thank you for Counter Narrative Project for making that work possible.
No problem. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.